She walked into the courtroom with a white cane, slow, fragile, and completely blind. 3 hours later, that same woman would turn her head at the exact moment everything fell apart. And in that 1 second, her entire lie collapsed. But here's what makes this case disturbing. Everyone believed her, the jury, the media, even the judge at first. Because Karen Whitmore didn't just act blind. She became it. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. You could feel it, that heavy, almost suffocating silence that only happens when something emotional is about to unfold. Karen entered slowly, her hand gripping the arm of her attorney. Her steps were careful, measured, almost too perfect. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of her cane echoed across the wooden floor. And people watched, not just looked. Watched, because something about her presence pulled attention like gravity. Her face was pale, expression soft, eyes slightly unfocused, staring into nothingness. A textbook presentation of blindness. But here's where things get interesting. No one questioned it, not yet. She lost her vision after the accident, her lawyer said softly, guiding her to the stand. And immediately, the emotional tone of the room shifted. You could see it on the jurors' faces. Sympathy, pain, even anger. Because the case, on the surface, was simple. Karen Whitmore was suing a construction company for negligence, claiming that a falling metal beam had struck her, leaving her permanently blind. A tragic accident, a life destroyed, and a corporation that allegedly tried to cover it up. Classic. Emotional. Powerful. The kind of case that usually ends with a massive payout. But here's what most people didn't notice. Something felt rehearsed. Not wrong. Not obvious. Just slightly too controlled. Watch closely, and you'd see it. Her breathing stayed steady even during emotional moments. Her posture remained perfect, never once losing balance. Her responses were precise, almost like she knew exactly when to pause. And that's a subtle detail most people ignore, because real trauma? It's messy, unpredictable. But Karen, she was consistent, too consistent. Now, let me ask you something. If someone truly lost their vision in a traumatic accident, would they be this composed? Or is that exactly what she wanted everyone to think? The prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, noticed it too. He didn't react immediately, didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. Because experienced prosecutors don't rush. They wait, they observe, they let the performance unfold. And Daniel? He was watching everything. The way her fingers tightened when certain questions came up, the microsecond delays before she answered, the slight tilt of her head when someone moved across the room. Tiny details. But in court, tiny details can destroy entire cases. Karen began her testimony. Her voice was soft, trembling just enough to feel real. I remember the sound before everything went dark. Pause, perfect pause. I heard the metal falling, and then silence. And just like that, the courtroom leaned in. Even the judge lowered his gaze slightly, because emotionally, she had them, every single person. But here's where it gets disturbing. As she described the moment she lost her sight, she instinctively flinched, not backward, not randomly, but toward the exact direction of a dropped pen across the room. And it was subtle, so subtle, most people missed it, but Daniel didn't. And in that moment, something clicked. This wasn't just a victim telling her story. This was a performance. And if you understand human behavior, you know one thing. People can fake words, they can fake emotions. But controlling instinct? That's where lies start to crack. Still, Daniel said nothing. Not yet. Because exposing a lie like this, it's not about catching someone once. It's about letting them build their own trap. Piece by piece, until escape becomes impossible, the defense team was confident. You could see it in their body language, relaxed shoulders, calm smiles, because from their perspective, they were winning. Easily, and Karen? She looked untouchable, a perfect victim, a heartbreaking story, a guaranteed verdict, but the courtroom hadn't seen everything yet, not even close, because what happened next would make everyone question everything they believed. And it wouldn't come from a witness or evidence, or even the lawyers. It would come from a moment so unexpected, so small, that no one was prepared for it. And when it happened, there was no going back. Now, here's where the story starts to shift, because Karen Whitmore wasn't just some random victim pulled into a tragic accident. She had a past, and not the kind people talk about openly. The kind that stays buried, unless someone goes looking. To the outside world, Karen looked like the perfect plaintiff, mid-30s. Educated, well-spoken. Before the accident, she worked as a corporate consultant. Someone who advised companies on communication strategy. Think about that for a second. Her entire career was built on one skill: controlling perception, framing narratives, guiding how people feel about a situation. That's not just a job, that's psychological influence at a professional level. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because if someone like that decides to lie, they don't just make up a story, they engineer it. Miss Whitmore, can you describe your life before the accident? Her lawyer's voice was gentle, calculated. This wasn't just a question, it was a setup. Karen lowered her head slightly, a controlled breath. I was independent, active. I loved reading, driving, traveling alone. She paused, let the words sink in. I had my life, and there it was, loss clean, precise, emotional, the kind of statement that lands directly in the jury's chest. Now watch closely. This is a classic persuasion tactic. You establish what was taken away before you even prove how it happened. Why? Because once people feel your loss, they stop questioning your truth. The jury shifted. One woman wiped her eye. Another juror leaned forward, completely engaged. And Karen? She stayed perfectly composed, not overwhelmed, not breaking down, just enough emotion to be believable, but never enough to lose control. Meanwhile, across the courtroom, Daniel Reeves sat still, pen in hand, not writing, just observing, because something didn't add up, and he knew it. Let's rewind the accident. According to Karen, she was walking past a construction site when a loose steel beam fell, striking her head. The impact allegedly caused severe optic nerve damage, permanent blindness. Tragic, clean, almost too clean. But here's what Daniel couldn't ignore. There were no direct witnesses, no clear footage of the impact, and the medical reports, they confirmed vision loss. But not how it happened. That's important. Because in court, injury doesn't always equal truth. And this is where the strategy begins. Daniel wasn't trying to prove she wasn't blind. Not yet. He was trying to understand who she really was. Because before you break a story, you break the person telling it. He started digging. Quickly, no dramatic moves, no accusations. Just questions. Karen's background showed something interesting. Before becoming a consultant, she briefly studied behavioral psychology. Not deeply, but enough to understand patterns, reactions, human perception, and that changes everything. Because now you're not just looking at a victim. You're looking at someone who understands how to perform reality. But wait, it gets deeper. 2 years before the accident, Karen was involved in a civil dispute. A smaller case, nothing major. But the details, that's where things get strange. She claimed emotional distress, manipulation, financial harm. And just like now, her testimony was described as convincing. Very convincing. She won that case. Now, on its own, that means nothing. People win cases all the time. But in behavioral analysis, patterns matter. And Daniel saw one forming. Back in the courtroom, Karen continued. I can't see my mother's face anymore. Her voice cracked slightly. Perfect timing. I don't even know what I look like now. Silence, heavy silence. And again. The jury leaned closer. But here's what most people missed in that moment. Her hand, resting on the stand, still, not trembling, not reacting, completely steady. And that's not how genuine emotional distress usually presents. Because when emotion spikes, the body follows. But Karen, she separated the two. Emotion and voice control in body. That's not natural. That's trained. Daniel leaned back slightly. And for the first time, he wrote something down. Just 2 words. Too perfect. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone who just felt off? Not enough to accuse, not enough to prove, but enough to make you question? That's exactly where Daniel was. And this is the most dangerous stage of any case, because suspicion without proof, it means nothing. And if he moved too early, He'd lose everything. Meanwhile, the defense team was building momentum. They introduced medical experts, tailed reports, emotional framing. Everything pointed in one direction. Karen Whitmore was a victim, and she deserved justice. But beneath all of it, a different story was slowly forming, invisible, coquette waiting, because Daniel had just made a decision. He wasn't going to challenge her story directly. Not yet. Instead, he was going to test her. Carefully, subtly, in ways she wouldn't expect. And if Karen was lying, she wouldn't break under pressure. She'd break under instinct. The next phase of the trial was about to begin. And what Daniel planned would change the entire case, because the truth about Karen Whitmore wasn't in what she said, it was in what she couldn't control. And very soon, that control would slip. Now this is where the tension starts to tighten, because Daniel Reeves wasn't preparing to attack, he was preparing to trap. And there's a big difference. Most lawyers go after inconsistencies directly. They challenge. They pressure. They try to force a mistake. But Daniel, he understood something deeper about human behavior. If someone is lying intentionally, they expect confrontation. They rehearse for it. They build defenses. But what they don't prepare for is subtle disruption. And that's exactly what he was about to do. The courtroom shifted as cross-examination began. Karen adjusted slightly in her seat, her chin lifted, her expression calm, still composed, still controlled, because from her perspective, she had already won the room. Daniel approached slowly. No aggression, no raised voice, just quiet confidence. Miss Whitmore. A pause. Thank you for your testimony. That alone caught people off guard, because this wasn't how cross-examinations usually begin. And right there, Karen relaxed, just slightly. A mistake most people wouldn't notice, but it mattered. Can you describe your morning routine now? After the accident. Simple question, non-threatening, almost irrelevant. But here's the trick. When you're lying about something big, you don't expect to be tested on something small. Karen nodded gently. I wake up. I use a voice-assisted device. I move carefully through my apartment. Her tone remained steady, controlled, rehearsed. Daniel listened, then took one step closer. And when you walk, how do you orient yourself in unfamiliar spaces? Another soft question, still harmless on the surface. I rely on memory, sound, and touch. Smooth answer, too smooth. Now watch what Daniel does next. He doesn't challenge her. He doesn't accuse her. He builds agreement. That's impressive, he said. A slight nod, adapting to something like that takes strength. And just like that, Karen leaned into it. Thank you. And this right here, this is a classic psychological opening. You validate. So the person lowers their guard, because when someone feels believed, they stop being careful. Daniel turned slightly, picked up a file, then casually asked, would you say your hearing has become more sensitive since the accident? Now this question? This is where things start getting dangerous, because heightened hearing is a common assumption about blindness, but it's also a trap. Karen answered without hesitation. Yes, absolutely. Too fast. No pause, no thought. And Daniel noticed, because real experiences, they take a second to recall, but rehearsed answers? They come instantly. The courtroom remained quiet, but the energy had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel took another step. Can you tell me what you hear right now? And this was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but critical. Karen tilted her head slightly, listening, performing. I hear the air conditioning, papers moving, people breathing. She paused, then added, your footsteps. And for a second, it sounded convincing. It really did. But here's what most people missed. Daniel hadn't moved. Not once. And just like that, a tiny crack appeared. Now, it wasn't enough, not yet, because one inconsistency doesn't destroy a case. But it plants doubt. And doubt spreads. Daniel didn't react, didn't expose it. He just nodded. Thank you. That's discipline, because the goal isn't to win the moment. It's to win the verdict. But Karen? She didn't realize what just happened, because from her perspective, everything was still under control. And that's the dangerous part. When someone believes they're winning, they stop checking themselves. Daniel shifted direction, completely. Miss Whitmore, do you remember the day of the accident clearly? Now this question. This is where emotion meets detail. And that's where liars struggle. Karen inhaled slowly. Yes, walk us through it. And just like that. The courtroom leaned in again. Because this wasn't just testimony anymore. This was reconstruction, Karen began. I was walking past the site. I heard a loud noise. And then everything went dark. Clean, Sybil. But too clean, Daniel interrupted gently. Which direction did the sound come from? And there it was. The question she didn't expect. Karen hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, but it was there. From above. Safe answer, logical, but incomplete. Daniel nodded slowly. Above, and slightly to your left, and this is where things get uncomfortable. Because now, he wasn't asking. He was guiding. Karen paused again. Longer this time. Yes, but here's the problem. That detail wasn't in her original statement, not once. And now, she had added it. Daniel looked at the jury, then back at her, calm, controlled. Interesting. And just like that, the atmosphere changed, because now, something didn't feel right. The jury felt it. The judge noticed it. Even Karen, for the first time, shifted in her seat. That tiny adjustment, that's discomfort. And discomfort means pressure is working. But Daniel wasn't done, not even close. Because everything so far? This was just the setup, what he had planned next. Wasn't about questions, it wasn't about words, it was about something far more dangerous. A moment, a single moment, that Karen couldn't rehearse, couldn't predict, and couldn't control. And when it happened, there would be no recovery, because instinct doesn't lie. Now this is where everything starts to feel different, because up until this point, Daniel Reeves had been testing Karen, quietly, carefully, almost invisibly. But now, he was about to move into something far more dangerous, provoking instinct. You see, words can be controlled, stories can be rehearsed, even emotions can be performed. But instinct is raw, immediate, unfiltered, and that's where truth lives. The courtroom settled again, that heavy silence returned. But this time, it wasn't sympathy, it was tension, because people could feel it now. Something was off. Daniel stepped back from the podium, not toward Karen, away from her. And that alone changed the energy, because distance creates unpredictability. Your Honor, he said calmly, with the court's permission, I'd like to conduct a brief demonstration. A demonstration? That word alone sent a ripple through the room. Because demonstrations in court, they're risky, unpredictable, and often revealing. Karen's attorney immediately stood. Objection. Relevance? Daniel didn't even look at him. It directly relates to the plaintiff's claims regarding sensory adaptation. Translation? He wasn't attacking her blindness. He was testing it. The judge paused, looked at Karen, then at Daniel, and, after a moment, proceed. Carefully. And just like that. The room shifted again. Now watch closely. Because what Daniel did next wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was surgical. He walked toward the clerk's desk, picked up a stack of files. Then, quietly, he dropped one. A sharp sound echoed, paper scattering across the floor. Karen flinched, slightly, her head turning, not randomly, not searching, but directly toward the source. Now pause here, because this is critical. Blind individuals don't turn precisely toward sudden sounds. They orient, gradually, they process, they adjust. But Karen? She reacted instantly, accurately, too accurately, the jury noticed. Not consciously yet, but subconsciously. You could see it in their faces. That subtle shift. Confusion. Daniel didn't say a word. He just crouched down, calmly gathering the papers, as if nothing happened. And that's what made it powerful, because he wasn't telling them something was wrong. He was letting them feel it. Karen adjusted her posture again. A little tighter this time, a little less confident. And here's what's fascinating. When control starts slipping, people try to compensate. They become more careful, more rigid. But that only makes things worse. Daniel returned to his position. Kit. Measured. Miss Whitmore, he said gently. Thank you for your patience. Polite, respectful, almost disarming. But underneath that calm tone, The trap was tightening. Let's talk about your daily navigation again. Back to simple questions, save territory. Or at least, that's what it seemed. Karen nodded. Yes. When you're in an unfamiliar environment, do you rely more on sound or memory? Sound, she replied. Always? Yes. No hesitation, no nuance, das Belutz. And that's a problem, because real experiences are rarely absolute. Daniel paused, then slowly. He stepped to the side, quietly. No sound, no warning. And then, he dropped his pen, a small sound, light barely noticeable compared to before. Karen didn't react, not immediately, not accurately. Instead, she hesitated, then turned, slightly off, and there it was. Inconsistency, because earlier, she reacted perfectly to a louder sound. Now, a softer one confused her. That's not how sensory adaptation works. The jury felt it. You could see the shift now, no longer subtle. Now it was visible. One juror leaned back, another frowned, someone crossed their arms, doubt, and once doubt enters a courtroom, it spreads fast. Karen's breathing changed, just slightly, but enough. And this is where psychological pressure becomes visible, because her performance, it was starting to crack. Daniel looked at her, not aggressively, not accusing, just observing. Is something wrong? He asked softly. And that question? It wasn't for her. It was for the jury, because now they were watching her, closely, critically. Karen forced a small smile. No. But her voice? It had changed, less steady, less controlled. And that's the moment everything begins to unravel. Because once someone becomes aware they're being watched, their behavior changes. And when behavior changes, truth starts to leak out. But Daniel still wasn't finished. Not even close. Because everything so far, the sounds, the reactions, the inconsistencies, this was all preparation. What he had planned next was something no one in that courtroom expected. Not the judge, not the jury, not even Karen. And when it happened, it wouldn't just create doubt. It would destroy her entire story. In one single moment, a moment so small, most people would miss it. But this time, no one would. The courtroom didn't just fall silent. It froze, because what they had just witnessed wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't inconsistency. It wasn't doubt. It was exposure. Karen Whitmore sat there. No cane. No performance, no control. Just a woman who had been caught in the one thing she couldn't fake, instinct. The judge leaned forward slowly, his voice calm, but heavy. Miss Whitmore, do you wish to explain what just occurred? Now pause here, because this moment, this is where most liars make their final mistake. They either deny harder, or they break. Karen tried the first. Her voice shaky now. That was reflex. I just reflex. Daniel interrupted quietly, not aggressively, just precise. And this is important. He didn't raise his voice. Because when truth is already visible, you don't need force. You tracked movement. Visually, he continued. You didn't react to sound. And just like that, her explanation collapsed. Karen swallowed. Her hands trembled for the first time. Real trembling. Uncontrolled. Because now, there was nothing left to perform. The jury wasn't emotional anymore. They weren't sympathetic. They were analyzing. And once an audience switches from emotion to logic, the story falls apart instantly. The defense attorney stood up quickly. Your Honor, this is speculative. Sit down, the judge said firmly. And that tone, that shift, it told everyone everything. This case was over. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because the truth didn't just stop at faking blindness. Daniel stepped forward one last time. Calm, controlled, deadly precise. We subpoenaed additional medical evaluations this morning. The courtroom stirred. And according to these reports, he placed the file on the table. There is no permanent optic nerve damage. Silence. Heavy, crushing. Karen's head dropped, because now, the lie wasn't just exposed, it was proven. This wasn't a mistake, this wasn't confusion, this was fraud. And here's the psychological reality. Maintaining a lie under pressure is one thing, but when evidence removes every escape, the brain shuts down. Karen didn't argue anymore, didn't defend, didn't speak. Because she knew, everyone knew. The judge removed his glasses slowly, a sign of finality. Miss Whitmore, Pause. This court finds your claims not only unsupported, he looked directly at her, but intentionally deceptive. Each word landed like a hammer. Your case is dismissed. Gasps filled the room, and furthermore, another pause. This matter will be referred for criminal investigation. And that was the moment everything ended. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with truth. Karen Whitmore walked into that courtroom as a victim, and walked out as a fraud. No cameras, no sympathy, no control, just consequences. Now let's talk about what really happened here, because this wasn't just a legal case. This was a psychological breakdown of deception. Karen didn't fail because her story was weak. She failed because she believed she could control everything. And that's the mistake. Because no matter how prepared you are, no matter how convincing your performance is, you cannot control instinct. And instinct always tells the truth. That one glance, that one moment, that one reaction dyed everything. So here's the lesson, not just for courtrooms, but for life. People can fake words. They can fake emotions. They can even fake entire identities. But under pressure, under the right moment, the truth doesn't need to be forced. It reveals itself. And when it does, there's no going back. And that's exactly what happened to Karen Whitmore. A perfect story, a perfect act, a perfect illusion, destroyed by a single, uncontrollable second. And that is how the truth wins.